Good evening, and welcome. Tonight we delve into one of the most persistent and challenging dilemmas facing modern societies. Is national security more important than individual freedom? In an era defined by sophisticated global threats and rapidly advancing technology, this question carries unprecedented weight. Joining us to explore this complex terrain are two distinguished guests with profoundly different perspectives. Mr. Marcus Thorne, former Chief of Intelligence, argues for the primacy of security as the foundation of a functioning society. And Ms. Isabella Rossi, a prominent human rights lawyer, champions the unwavering defense of civil liberties against state intrusion. We will begin with opening statements, followed by rebuttals, a moderated discussion, and concluding remarks. Mr. Thorne, you have the floor first.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Good evening. Let me be unequivocal from the outset. National security is not merely important. It is the fundamental prerequisite upon which all cherished freedoms, including individual liberty, are built and sustained. Without a baseline of safety and order, the very concept of exercising personal freedom becomes a precarious, if not entirely theoretical, notion. We are no longer confronting threats that are easily identifiable or geographically contained. We face asymmetrical warfare, sophisticated international terrorist networks capable of intricate planning, state-sponsored cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure, and pervasive espionage aiming to destabilize our institutions. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They represent tangible, evolving dangers that demand proactive and sophisticated countermeasures. Consequently, measures such as intelligence gathering, targeted surveillance, and comprehensive data analysis become indispensable tools. These are not, as some might portray, instruments of oppression by design. Rather, when implemented under rigorous legal frameworks and stringent oversight, they are essential mechanisms for preempting catastrophic events and protecting the populace from grievous harm. The primary duty of any legitimate government is the protection of its citizens. This isn't a choice. It's a solemn obligation. To fulfill this duty effectively in the current climate requires capabilities that may, regrettably, intersect with areas traditionally considered private. The notion of absolute, inviolable individual freedom or privacy, while an admirable ideal, represents a dangerous naivete when juxtaposed with the reality of those who actively seek to exploit our openness for destructive ends. We cannot afford to be paralyzed by an ideological absolutism that prevents us from taking necessary precautions. This is not a call for unchecked power, but for a pragmatic, proportionate balancing act. We must weigh the potential infringement on certain liberties against the potential for mass casualties or societal collapse. The objective is not to diminish freedom, but to safeguard the conditions under which freedom can actually exist and flourish. Security, therefore, is not freedom's adversary, but its indispensable guardian.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne. Ms. Rossi, your opening statement.
Thank you, Dr. Reed. Good evening. Mr. Thorne presents a seductive argument, framing security as the necessary precursor to liberty. However, I contend that this framing fundamentally misunderstands the very essence of a free and democratic society. Individual freedoms, the right to privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, the right to due process, are not privileges granted by the state when it feels secure enough to bestow them. They are inherent, inalienable rights that constitute the core value and defining characteristic of the societies we strive to be. They are the ends, not merely the means. History provides a stark and cautionary tale regarding the path Mr. Thorne advocates. The argument that security necessitates the curtailment of liberty is the perennial justification for state overreach. Measures enacted in times of perceived crisis, often under the banner of temporary necessity, have an alarming tendency to become permanent fixtures, gradually eroding the very freedoms they purportedly protect. This slippery slope is not a hypothetical fear, it is a documented pattern. It leads toward societies where dissent is chilled, conformity is enforced, and the state operates beyond meaningful public scrutiny. Furthermore, let us critically examine the efficacy and costs of the security measures often proposed. Mass surveillance programs, for instance, generate vast oceans of data, but their record in actually preventing attacks is debatable and often overstated. Meanwhile, their costs are immense, not just financially, but in terms of the erosion of trust between citizens and the state, the potential for discriminatory application against minority groups, and the chilling effect on legitimate political discourse and journalism. Any measure that infringes upon fundamental rights must be subject to the most stringent conditions: absolute necessity, strict proportionality, transparent legal frameworks, independent judicial oversight, and mechanisms for redress. Due process is not an inconvenient obstacle. It is the bedrock of the rule of law, protecting individuals from arbitrary state power. True, enduring security does not arise solely from surveillance cameras and intelligence databases. It is built upon social cohesion, economic justice, respect for human rights, and public trust in accountable institutions. Undermining these foundations in the name of security is profoundly counterproductive, potentially creating the very alienation and resentment that extremist groups exploit. Therefore, this debate is not merely about balancing two competing goods. It is about defending the fundamental character of a free society against the corrosive influence of fear-driven securitization. We must resist the narrative that forces a false dichotomy between being safe and being free. Our goal must be to be both.
Thank you, Ms. Rossi. Mr. Thorne, you now have an opportunity to respond to Ms. Rossi's points.
Ms. Rossi paints a compelling picture of the potential for abuse, invoking the, quote, slippery slope argument. While historical vigilance is warranted, it is overly pessimistic, bordering on deterministic, to suggest that any enhancement of security powers inevitably leads to authoritarianism. Robust democratic institutions, an independent judiciary, active legislative oversight, and a free press are precisely the mechanisms designed to prevent such a slide. The challenge is not to reject necessary tools out of fear, but to ensure these oversight mechanisms are sufficiently empowered and vigilant. It is a manageable risk, not an inescapable descent. Regarding the effectiveness of surveillance, Ms. Rossi questions its track record. While specific operational successes must often remain classified to protect sources and methods, I can assure you that intelligence derived from legally sanctioned surveillance, including bulk data analysis, has been instrumental in disrupting numerous plots. Dismissing these tools wholesale ignores the intricate, often fragmented nature of modern threats, where connecting seemingly disparate pieces of information is crucial for prevention. Furthermore, the critique of applying traditional due process in all circumstances fails to grapple with the speed and covert nature of contemporary threats. When intelligence suggests an imminent, large-scale attack is hours away, demanding the same procedural steps required for a standard criminal investigation might be tantamount to accepting mass casualties. We need frameworks that allow for swift, decisive action in extraordinary circumstances, albeit still subject to subsequent review and accountability. Proportionality must consider the scale of the potential harm being averted. Ultimately, we cannot allow an idealized conception of rights to blind us to the catastrophic risks of inaction or overly restrictive security postures. The potential consequences of failure are simply too grave.
Thank you. Ms. Rossi, your rebuttal.
Mr. Thorne places considerable faith in existing oversight mechanisms. While these institutions are indeed vital, their effectiveness in the face of national security imperatives has often proven inadequate. The very nature of intelligence work often involves secrecy, which inherently complicates transparency and accountability. We have witnessed numerous instances globally where national security classifications were invoked to shield questionable, ineffective, or even illegal activities from proper scrutiny by legislatures, courts, and the public. The promise of oversight can be illusory if the overseers lack timely access to complete information or the political will to challenge the security establishment. Furthermore, Mr. Thorne defends broad surveillance capabilities by citing their necessity in connecting disparate dots. This justification often underpins arguments for mass data collection, yet it fails to adequately address the principle of proportionality. Why resort to collecting data on entire populations when resources could be focused on targeted investigations based on reasonable suspicion and judicially approved warrants? Mass surveillance risks treating everyone as a potential suspect, fundamentally altering the citizen-state relationship. Mr. Thorne's point about adapting due process for imminent threats is particularly troubling. While emergency situations may require expedited procedures, abandoning core principles like judicial authorization or the presumption of innocence sets extremely dangerous precedents. Such exceptions, once created, have a tendency to become normalized, fundamentally altering the justice system away from individual rights towards preemptive state action based on potentially flawed intelligence. Finally, the argument that inaction poses catastrophic risks ignores the profound societal damage caused by excessive securitization itself. When citizens feel constantly monitored, when their communications are routinely intercepted, trust in government plummets. This erosion of trust can hinder community cooperation with law enforcement, stifle legitimate dissent, and ultimately create a less resilient, less secure society in the long run. We risk damaging the fabric of our democracy in the name of protecting it.
Let's move into a more direct discussion. Mr. Thorne. Ms. Rossi raises concerns about mass surveillance versus targeted approaches. In the context of preventing, say, a sophisticated cyber attack on critical infrastructure, where perpetrators could be anywhere, is mass data monitoring unavoidable? What level of intrusion is acceptable?
Dr. Reed, cyber threats are uniquely challenging due to their borderless and often anonymous nature. Identifying malicious actors within vast networks sometimes necessitates analyzing broad traffic patterns to detect anomalies or signatures associated with known threats. It's not about reading everyone's emails, but about employing sophisticated algorithms to identify high-risk activities, much like a bank monitors transactions for fraud. The intrusion is targeted at the asterisk activity, not indiscriminately at individuals. The acceptable level involves robust technical safeguards, strict minimization protocols ensuring only relevant data is retained, and, crucially, independent oversight verifying compliance. The alternative, waiting for an attack to cripple our power grid or financial systems, is unacceptable.
Ms. Rossi, Mr. Thorne speaks of safeguards and oversight. Do you believe such systems can ever be truly effective when dealing with the secrecy inherent in intelligence work and the sheer scale of data involved?
While safeguards are essential, their effectiveness is perpetually challenged. The sheer volume of data makes meaningful oversight incredibly difficult. How can an oversight body realistically scrutinize algorithms processing billions of data points daily? Furthermore, the definition of relevant or suspicious activity can be overly broad or subject to bias, potentially leading to discriminatory targeting. Secrecy often prevents those affected from even knowing they were surveilled, let alone challenging it. True accountability requires transparency, and that is often the first casualty when national security is invoked.
A question for both of you. Consider emerging technologies like facial recognition in public spaces or AI-driven predictive policing. Where do you draw the line? Ms. Rossi, is there any times application of such technology you would find acceptable for security purposes?
The potential for misuse with technologies like pervasive facial recognition is immense. Its deployment risks creating a society of perpetual surveillance, chilling free assembly and association. Predictive policing based on AI carries significant risks of reinforcing existing biases and leading to discriminatory outcomes. Any acceptable use would require extremely narrow parameters, perhaps locating a specific missing person or an identified dangerous fugitive under strict judicial warrant, not general, preventative monitoring of the populace. The default must be prohibition, with exceptions only under the most stringent, democratically agreed upon, and rigorously overseen conditions.
Mr. Thorne, your perspective on these technologies, is there a point where a security measure becomes too intrusive, regardless of its potential effectiveness?
These technologies offer potentially powerful tools for public safety, identifying suspects in real time, potentially preventing crimes. However, I agree that their deployment requires careful consideration and robust regulation. The line is crossed when a measure fundamentally alters the nature of society towards one of constant, unjustified monitoring, or when it lacks adequate safeguards against error and abuse. For instance, deploying facial recognition indiscriminately without clear purpose or oversight would be unacceptable. But using it to secure critical infrastructure entry points or identify known terrorists in high-risk areas, under strict controls, could be justifiable. The key is regulation. Transparency about how it's used, even if not when in specific operations, and ensuring proportionality. It's about responsible adoption, not outright rejection of potentially life-saving tools.
We are nearing the end of our time. Mr. Thorne, please provide your closing statement.
In conclusion, the debate between security and freedom is often presented as a zero-sum game. But this is a misleading simplification. A secure environment, free from pervasive fear of violence or societal disruption, is the essential foundation upon which meaningful individual liberties can actually be exercised. Modern threats necessitate modern, adaptable security measures, implemented pragmatically and proportionately, with robust oversight. To ignore these realities out of ideological purity or complacency is to court disaster. We must prioritize the collective safety that enables all other societal goods, including freedom itself, to endure.
Thank you. Ms. Rossi, your closing statement.
The allure of security is powerful, particularly in uncertain times. Yet, we must remain eternally vigilant against the erosion of the fundamental rights that define a free and just society. Individual liberty, privacy, and due process are not luxuries to be traded away for perceived safety. They are the very objectives we seek to preserve. History teaches us that unchecked state power, even when initially well-intentioned, poses a grave threat. Accountability, transparency, and strict adherence to the rule of law are non-negotiable safeguards. Let us not sacrifice the enduring principles of liberty on the altar of potentially illusory short-term security gains. We must defend freedom, not as a secondary concern, but as our primary commitment.
Thank you, Mr. Thorne and Ms. Rossi, for this insightful and vigorous debate on a profoundly important issue. You have clearly articulated the complex and often conflicting values at stake, leaving us all with much to consider. The tension between national security and individual freedom remains a critical challenge for democratic societies, demanding ongoing